Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Retire and Roam. If you're someone who thinks carefully about retirement, watches your spending, values freedom, loves American history, and still believes the road can teach you something new, today's journey is for you. When most people picture Washington State, they imagine Seattle's shining skyline, Mount Rainier rising above the clouds, or those warm little coffee shops that make the whole state feel inviting and alive. It looks polished, prosperous, and full of promise. But there is another Washington hiding behind that postcard image. A quieter Washington. A forgotten Washington. A landscape of abandoned streets, weathered storefronts, empty schoolhouses, and towns that once pulsed with ambition until time, economics, isolation, or nature erased them from everyday memory. These are not just old places on a map. They are reminders of how fast fortunes can rise, how suddenly communities can disappear, and how important it is to build a life that can adapt when the world changes. Here on Retire and Roam, we do more than visit places. We uncover the stories buried beneath them and the lessons they still have for people like us today. People thinking about where to go next, how to live well, and what truly lasts. Washington has more than 150 documented ghost towns, and in this video, we're counting down 15 of the most fascinating ones you've probably never heard of. Stay with me all the way to the end, because our number one town went to war with a mountain and lost. And before we hit the road, subscribe to Retire and Roam for more journeys that feed your curiosity and your sense of freedom. Part 1. The Illusion of Permanence. We spend so much of our lives trying to build things that feel secure. A career, a home, a savings plan, a retirement we can count on. We tell ourselves that if we work hard enough and plan carefully enough, what we build will last. But the first 3 towns on our list tell a different story. They remind us that permanence is often an illusion, and sometimes the very ground beneath the community can shift without warning. That is what makes ghost towns so fascinating. They are not just relics of the past, they are warnings written directly into the landscape. 15. Nagrom, King County. Let's begin with number 15, a place in King County with a name that feels like a riddle. Nagrom. Read it backward and you get Morgan, the surname of Elmer G. Morgan, the man who founded the town in 1910. There is something almost poetic about that choice. He carved a lumber town out of the wilderness along the Green River and named it after himself in reverse, as though the town already carried the shadow of its own disappearance. And for a while, Nagrom looked like a success story. Morgan pushed hard to get the Northern Pacific Railway to extend service into the area. Once that happened, families arrived, homes were built, and the sawmill became the center of daily life. The town worked the way so many frontier towns worked in the West. Hard labor, long days, and a shared belief that the future was finally taking shape. But Nagrom did not die from bankruptcy, and it did not go down in flames. Its end came from something far less dramatic and far more powerful: water. Flooding carried contamination from the settlement into Tacoma's water supply, raising fears of typhoid and public health disaster. Faced with that threat, the city of Tacoma made a decision that erased the town in a way few people would ever expect. It bought the land and removed the settlement to protect the watershed. Just like that, ambition gave way to necessity. Human plans gave way to the greater good. Today, Nagrum is protected land, and the river that once helped sustain the town now runs through it in quiet authority, as if reminding us who was always in charge. And maybe that is the deeper lesson here. Sometimes we work so hard to leave behind a mark, only to discover that the most meaningful legacy is not another building, another road, or another enterprise. Sometimes the best thing we can leave behind is open land, clean water, and the humility to step aside when nature demands it. 14. Tlaquato, Lewis County. From Nagrum, we move to number 14, and this one tells a very different story. Tlaquato, in Lewis County, shows us just how fragile a town can become when too much of its identity rests on one person. Back in 1851, a man named Lewis Hawkins Davis came west from Missouri and claimed land in what was then still a rough and developing part of Washington Territory. He did what so many determined founders did in those years. He built not just a business, but a community. He established a sawmill, helped shape a town, and invested himself so deeply in the place that Tlaquato became one of the early centers of local life. By the 1860s, it had grown into a bustling county seat with real momentum and real promise. But then came a single tragic moment. In 1864, Davis fell from his own sawmill and died. And when he died, something larger than one man was lost. It was as if the town's engine stopped turning. Over time, the county seat was moved elsewhere, the railroad bypassed Tlaquato, and the life slowly drained out of it. By 1902, the town was officially abandoned. What remains today is striking in a different way from the ruined mining camps and crumbling industrial towns people usually imagine. Tlaquato still holds on to a pioneer cemetery and a beautiful white wooden church built in 1858, the oldest surviving Protestant church in Washington. That church stands like a quiet testimony, not just to faith, but to memory. It tells us that even after the energy of a place disappears, some symbols remain to remind us what people once tried to build there. And that is what makes Tlaquato feel so personal. Its lesson is not really about a railroad or a county seat. It is about dependence. When a town, a family, or even a business depends too heavily on one person to carry the whole weight, it becomes dangerously vulnerable. True stability comes from shared responsibility. Real legacy is not about being indispensable. It is about building something that can live on without you. That idea matters just as much in retirement as it does in history. Many people spend decades being the one who holds everything together, financially, emotionally, practically. But Tlaquato reminds us that strength grows when the load is shared, not when it is carried alone. 13. Copper City, Yakima County. Now we come to number 13, Copper City in Yakima County, a town born not from caution, but from confidence. If Nagrum teaches us about nature, and Tlaquato teaches us about dependence, Copper City teaches us about the danger of building a future around an expectation that never arrives. The name itself tells you what people believed. This was a place founded on copper, and copper meant money, real money. By the early 20th century, The area had around 42 active mining claims, and the atmosphere must have been full of certainty. The ore was there, the opportunity looked real, and the founders were convinced that lasting wealth was just one step away. That one step was the railroad. Like so many small western towns, Copper City believed that if the tracks came through, everything else would follow. Growth, stability, profit, permanence. But the railroad never came. And without it, the whole economic equation began to collapse. Moving ore out of the region was slow, costly, and inefficient. As expenses climbed and the dream of easy transport faded, the mines gradually lost their viability. By 1942, the operation had gone quiet. What makes Copper City especially haunting is that the copper never disappeared. It is still there, locked in the rock, just as valuable in theory as it ever was. But value on paper is not the same as value in real life. If the system needed to make use of it never arrives, even a rich resource can remain untouched. That is such an important lesson, especially for viewers thinking about retirement, financial security, or the next chapter of life. So many people postpone peace, joy, and purpose because they are waiting for their version of the train to come in. Maybe it is the perfect market condition. Maybe it is the ideal home price. Maybe it is the promotion, the inheritance, the perfect timing, or the day when everything finally lines up. But Copper City reminds us that a life built entirely on a future expectation is always at risk. At some point, we have to deal with reality as it is, not as we hope it will become. We have to make decisions based on what is in front of us, not only on what we imagine might someday arrive. That is not pessimism. That is wisdom. And that is what makes these first 3 towns such a powerful beginning to our journey. One disappeared because nature had the final word. One faded because too much depended on one man. And one collapsed because an imagined future never showed up. Together, they remind us that permanence is never guaranteed. Not in towns, not in markets, not in life. And as we move deeper into this list, the stories only get stranger. Because next, we step into places built on gold, wheat, timber, and pure American optimism, where boom times came fast and collapse came even faster. Part 2. Boom, bust, and burgers. As we move deeper into our countdown, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. So many of these towns were not built for balance, and they were not built for the long haul. They were built fast, on opportunity, speculation, and resource extraction. Gold, timber, wheat. For a few shining years, that was enough to make a place feel permanent. Saloons filled up, general stores opened their doors, families put down roots, and people convinced themselves they had found not just a livelihood, but a future. But when a town depends on one resource, one railroad, or one market price, it can rise quickly and fall just as fast. And sometimes, the only thing left behind is a strange little reminder of how people adapted when the original dream collapsed. 12. Chesaw, Okanogan County. At number 12, we come to Chesaw, tucked away in Okanogan County. And this one begins with a detail that already sets it apart. The town was named after a Chinese miner, Chi Saw, who settled there in the late 19th century. In the American West, where Chinese laborers were so often exploited, excluded, or erased from public memory, that kind of recognition was rare. So before we even get to the boom and bust story, Chisaw already tells us something important about the people who passed through it and the traces they left behind. Then came gold, and with gold came the familiar explosion of optimism. Chisaw became a real boom town, with hotels, stores, saloons, and a bank. It had the energy of a place convinced it was only moving in one direction, forward. If you had walked through town during its peak years, you probably would have seen the classic architecture of Western ambition, those false front buildings designed to make modest structures look taller, grander, and more prosperous than they really were. Even the buildings were participating in the illusion. But eventually, as always, the ore thinned out and the excitement drained away. The gold that had pulled people in could not keep them there forever. Businesses closed, structures decayed, and time slowly stripped away the performance of prosperity. Yet Chisaw did not disappear in quite the way you might expect. One humble thing endured: a working tavern that still serves burgers. And honestly, that may be the most American ending imaginable. A gold town turns into a burger stop. A place once driven by dreams of sudden wealth survives by feeding people who come through. There is something wonderfully practical about that. Chisaw's lesson is not just about decline. It is about adjustment. When the original dream stops working, the people who survive are often the ones willing to change the dream. That is true in retirement too. A lot of us spend years imagining one ideal version of the future, one perfect financial plan, one perfect place to settle, one perfect path. But real life often asks for something more flexible. Chisaw reminds us that there is no shame in pivoting. Maybe you do not strike gold. Maybe the big plan changes. But if you can still create value, still serve others, still build something useful, then the story is not over. Sometimes survival is not glamorous. Sometimes it looks like a tavern, a grill, and the wisdom to meet people where they are. 11. Sherman, Lincoln County. From Chisaw, we move to number 11, Sherman, in Lincoln County. And this town tells a quieter story, but in some ways an even more familiar one. Sherman was shaped not by silver fever or dramatic mining strikes, but by something simpler and more grounded: wheat and hope. Like many communities in eastern Washington, Sherman grew during the homesteading era of the 1880s. Families came to work the land, to plant, harvest, and build a life around agriculture. For a while, that model held. Small towns like Sherman became local centers of daily life, with a schoolhouse, a church, and the ordinary institutions that make a place feel like home. There was no great theatrical rise here, no fever dream of instant riches, just the slow, hard-working confidence of people who believed the land would sustain them. But then, the pressures began to shift. Wheat prices fell, and with that, the economic foundation weakened. And then came one of the great ironies of American development: better roads. At first glance, that should have helped a town like Sherman. Better transportation is supposed to mean more opportunity. But in reality, those improved roads made it easier for farmers and residents to travel to larger nearby cities, especially Spokane, where there were more stores, more services, and more reasons to spend time and money elsewhere. And that is how Sherman began to fade. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in the slow, quiet way a fire dies when nothing is left to feed it. People did not necessarily run away. They simply stopped needing the town in the way they once had. The schoolhouse, the church, even the cemetery remained, but the daily life that animated them was gone. There is something deeply relevant about that story today. We tend to celebrate convenience without always asking what it costs us. Bigger roads, faster travel, more centralized services, online shopping, giant regional hubs. These things make life easier in some ways, but they can also hollow out the small communities that once held people together. Sherman reminds us that connection and convenience are not always the same thing. For those of us who travel, relocate, or think about where and how to live in retirement, that matters. It is easy to chase efficiency. The cheaper gas, the lower taxes, the bigger store, the easier drive. But every time we bypass the small town diner, the local museum, the family-owned stop along the highway, we participate a little more in the same process that left places like Sherman behind. Its story asks us to slow down enough to notice what still stands and to appreciate the communities that survive on the margins of modern convenience. 10. Bordeaux, Thurston County. Now at number 10, we head west to Bordeaux, and here the story shifts from agriculture to timber. Bordeaux was a classic company town, built around the Mason County Logging Company and tied completely to the surrounding forest. Its reason for existing was simple: trees. As long as the timber was profitable, the town had a purpose. When that purpose disappeared, so did the town. This was the age of cut-and-run forestry, an approach that prioritized extraction over stewardship. The goal was not to build a durable community that could thrive for generations. The goal was to harvest the resource, process it efficiently, and move on when the numbers stopped working. So when the surrounding timber was exhausted and the mill became less efficient, the company did exactly what that model encouraged it to do. It dismantled the town and left. Today, what remains of Bordeaux is mostly hidden: concrete foundations, rusted machinery, fragments of industrial life swallowed by second-growth forest. Nature has come back, but not as untouched wilderness. It is regrowth layered over what used to be a system of aggressive extraction. And that makes Bordeaux feel especially modern. It is not just a ghost town. It is a case study in what happens when profit outruns permanence. 9. Taunton, Adams County. And right beside that lesson, at number 9, is Taunton in Adams County. Taunton was different in industry, but similar in logic. It was a railroad outpost, a town created to serve a transportation system moving through central Washington. Its existence depended on being useful to the trains. That was the entire model. And as long as the routes held and the logistics made sense, Taunton mattered. But towns built only for function are often the most fragile of all. The moment transportation patterns change, the reason for the town can disappear almost overnight. As routes consolidated and technology evolved, the need for Taunton faded. The people were no longer essential to the system, and once that happened, the town dissolved back into the dry landscape that had temporarily hosted it. There is something stark about towns like Bordeaux and Taunton because they strip away the romance. These places were not undone by mystery. They were undone by design. They were built inside systems that never intended to value long-term human continuity. Once efficiency moved elsewhere, the communities were left behind. And that may be the real lesson of this section. Chisor, Sherman, Bordeaux, and Taunton all reveal different versions of the same truth. A place can survive hardship, but it struggles to survive a model that treats people as temporary. Gold runs out. Wheat prices fall. Timber gets cut. Rail lines shift. And when a town has been built only around extraction, logistics, or short-term gain, there is often very little left to hold it together once the cycle turns. That is worth thinking about far beyond ghost towns. In our own lives, are we building something sustainable, or are we just running on whatever is immediately productive? Are we nurturing relationships, routines, and communities that can last through change? Or are we living in a way that depends entirely on one stream of income, one market condition, one system, one assumption? Because these towns may be old, but their warning is not. A life built only on extraction eventually feels empty. A life built with adaptability, local connection, and long-term thinking has a much better chance of enduring. And as our road trip continues, the stories grow even darker. Because next, we enter a world shaped not just by markets and resources, but by corporate control, industrial pressure, and towns where people learned the hard way what happens when a company owns far more than your job. Part 3. The Corporate Monopolies. As our journey continues, the mood changes again. Up to this point, we have seen towns collapse because of nature, isolation, bad timing, and the rise and fall of local industry. But now, we step into something even more unsettling. The Pacific Northwest was not shaped by pioneers alone. It was also shaped by powerful corporations that controlled land, labor, transportation, and entire communities. And when people are treated less like neighbors and more like units of production, the result is rarely stable for long. These next towns remind us that when a company owns your paycheck, your house, your food supply, and in some cases your future, it can also take all of it away. 8. Melmont, Pierce County. At number 8, we arrive at Melmont, a coal town in Pierce County founded in 1900. On paper, it was a place of work and opportunity. In reality, it was a place where one company controlled almost every part of daily life. The Northwest Improvement Company, closely tied to the railroad, dominated the town. If you lived in Melmont, the company determined your wages, your housing, and even where you bought your groceries. It was not just your employer, it was the structure around your entire existence. That kind of control created enormous tension, and in Melmont, that pressure did not stay hidden. On Christmas Eve in 1905, one miner became so enraged that he packed dynamite beneath his foreman's house and lit the fuse. The foreman survived, but the event tells you more about life in Melmont than any official report ever could. It reveals a town simmering under strain, where economic dependence and personal dignity were in constant conflict. For a while, the coal kept the system running. But company towns are only as secure as the industry that justifies them. Once the railroads began switching from steam to diesel in 1918, coal lost its central importance. Demand fell. Workers were let go. Families moved on. Then, like an ugly final chapter, fire swept through what remained. Today, Melmont has been softened by time. You can hike through the area and pass moss-covered foundations, traces of buildings, and the old school basement quietly hidden in the landscape. It is beautiful now, but it is the beauty of something reclaimed after being used up. And that may be the most haunting part of Melmont. It asks a question that still matters today. What happens to a person when the system they built their life around no longer needs them? 7. Franklin, King County. That question follows us directly into number 7, Franklin, another coal town, this one east of Black Diamond in King County. If Melmont was intense and short-lived, Franklin was deeper, larger, and more enduring. This town helped power Seattle's early industrial growth, and unlike many ghost towns that burned bright and vanished quickly, Franklin's mines operated for decades. Coal was pulled from the earth here all the way until 1971. That long lifespan makes Franklin especially powerful to think about. This was not a brief experiment. This was a place where generations worked, raised families, built routines, and tied their identities to the mine. The town mattered because the work mattered, and for a long time, that relationship seemed solid. But even long chapters end. Walking into Franklin today is said to feel deeply haunting, not because of theatrical ghost stories, but because of scale. The ruins still hint at the sheer physical effort it took to extract that much energy from the ground. Moss now covers what industry once claimed. Nature has crept over the foundations, the machinery, and the edges of what used to feel permanent. Hidden in the woods is a cemetery where many of the men who built their lives there now rest, mostly absent from the maps and headlines of the modern world. And that is where Franklin becomes more than an old coal town. It becomes a mirror. Because so many people, especially after decades of work, quietly wrestle with the same issue. If your job shaped your routine, your identity, your friendships, and your sense of worth, then who are you when that job is gone? Retirement can be liberating, but it can also be disorienting if your whole self was wrapped up in what you did for a living. That is the real lesson of Franklin and Melmont together. Companies may provide income, structure, and purpose for a season, but they do not define your value. Industries rise, technologies change, and employers move on. If our sense of self is built only on a job title, it becomes dangerously fragile. These towns remind us to build an identity that can outlast the company gate, the mine shaft, and the final paycheck. 6. Ruby City, Okanogan County. And now we come to number 6, Ruby City, one of the most dramatic examples on this list of what happens when ambition outruns reality. If Melmont and Franklin reveal the harsh logic of corporate power, Ruby City reveals something different but equally destructive: human ego. Ruby City was born in 1888 on the promise of silver, and almost immediately it began to dream far too big. Prospectors poured into the area, businesses sprang up. Within months, the town had general stores, hotels, saloons, and even its own newspaper. It was not content to be a rough mining camp. It imagined itself as something grander, wealthier, more permanent. People even called it the Babylon of the West. That nickname tells you everything. This was a town intoxicated by its own potential. It expanded fast, spoke boldly, and carried itself with the confidence of a place certain it had arrived. It even became the county seat, which must have felt like proof that the future belonged to it. It held that title for exactly 11 months. That is one of the sharpest collapses in this entire countdown. The silver rush cooled almost as fast as it had begun. Investors pulled back. Businesses shut their doors. Confidence evaporated. And before the town even had time to become fully established, it was already dying. Today, all that remains are low stone walls hidden in the brush, the rough footprint of a place that believed deeply in its own permanence and was brutally corrected. What makes Ruby City memorable is not just how fast it rose, but how completely it mistook excitement for stability. And that is a lesson people still need. In finance, in real estate, in retirement planning, and in life, there is always some version of Ruby City waiting to seduce us. The hot market, the quick gain, the big speculative bet, the dream of becoming rich, important, or secure overnight. But history is full of places that looked unstoppable right before they vanished. Ruby City reminds us that fast growth can be thrilling, but it is not the same as strong foundations. Slow, thoughtful, sustainable progress may not look as glamorous, but it tends to last a lot longer. Real wealth, real security, and real peace are usually built gradually, not in a fever dream. And that is what makes this stretch of our journey so powerful. Monte shows us what happens when a company controls too much. Franklin shows us how deeply work can shape identity. Ruby City shows us the danger of believing hype over reality. Different stories, different industries, different endings, but all of them point to the same truth. Anything built on pressure, dependence, or arrogance is far more fragile than it appears. And as we move into the next part of our countdown, the stories take another turn, because now we enter the strangest territory of all, where ghost towns are tangled up with murder, mystery, superstition, and communities that refuse to disappear quietly. Part 4. Ghosts, Murders, and Moving Towns. Now we arrive at the most haunting stretch of our journey, and in many ways, the most unforgettable. Up to this point, we have seen towns fade because the money ran out, the railroads shifted, the companies left, or nature quietly took control again. But these next places feel different. These are the towns that refused to vanish politely. Some held on through sheer stubbornness. Some were reshaped by rumor, conflict, and reinvention. And some were marked by violence so unsettling that the silence they left behind still seems to hang in the air. 5. Nighthawk, Okanagan County. At number 5 is Nighthawk, near the Canadian border, and this town has a presence that is hard to explain until you picture it. Most ghost towns feel broken apart by time. Nighthawk feels paused by it. That is what makes it so remarkable. It is officially recognized as a ghost town, yet so much of it still appears visibly, almost stubbornly present. The old hotel, the schoolhouse, the mill structures, these are not just scraps in the dirt. They still stand there, weathered but honest, like survivors of a century-long conversation with the wind. Nighthawk began as a mining town, one more place built on the promise that what lay beneath the ground could support a future above it. For a time, that promise was enough. But what makes Nighthawk memorable is not simply that it rose and declined. It is the fact that it still feels tangible. When the afternoon light hits those old storefronts, it can seem as if time has folded in on itself. The place does not feel staged for tourists, and it does not feel polished for modern visitors. It feels real, quiet, unhurried, like the past never fully packed up and left. And that gives Nighthawk a special kind of beauty. It reminds us that not everything old needs to be restored into something shiny to be meaningful. Sometimes the dignity of a place is found in its age, its weathered boards, its unpolished truth. For travelers, retirees, and history lovers, that is part of the appeal. Nighthawk offers something rare in modern America, a place that has not been over-explained. You simply stand there and let it speak for itself. 4. Molson, Okanogan County. If Nighthawk feels quiet and almost poetic, number 4, Molson, feels like a story someone would invent if history were not already strange enough. Founded in 1900 by an investor connected to the famous Canadian brewing family, Molson had all the ingredients of another ambitious Western town. But what happened next was so chaotic that it almost sounds fictional. Molson did not collapse once. It collapsed, revived, and shifted again. First, the mining hopes faded, and the population dropped dramatically, from a lively little settlement to barely a dozen people. Then came the rumor that so many frontier towns depended on: the railroad might arrive. That possibility was enough to spark new energy, and a second version of the town, often called New Molson, began taking shape about a mile away. But then, the situation became even more surreal. A land dispute broke out, and in response, buildings were literally moved from one site to the other. Imagine that for a moment. Entire structures being dragged in the night, neighbors taking sides, a town quite literally splitting itself apart over where its future would stand. That kind of stubbornness is almost unbelievable, and yet it perfectly captures the frontier instinct to keep improvising, even when the situation borders on absurd. In the end, the railroad never truly delivered the salvation people hoped for. But Molson still found a way to endure, not as a living boomtown, but as a preserved memory. Today, it functions as an open-air museum with full-scale original buildings, and that may be the best ending the town could have asked for. It did not become the prosperous hub its founders imagined, but it also did not disappear into nothing. Instead, it became a place where people can walk through the past and see how fragile, strange, and determined these communities really were. That is why Molson feels more than quirky. It carries a lesson about preservation. History does not always survive on its own. Sometimes people choose to save it. Sometimes they gather the remains of failure, conflict, and disappointment and turn them into something worth remembering. Molson tells us that even our most chaotic chapters can still become meaningful if we care enough to preserve them. 3. Bodie, Okanogan County. At number 3, we come to Bodie. And yes, many people hear the name and immediately think of California. But Washington has its own Bodie, hidden deep in the Colville National Forest. And it has a very different kind of power. If Molson feels dramatic, Bodie feels mysterious. It does not shout for attention, it lingers. Like so many towns on this list, Bodie was born in the excitement of a gold rush. In the early 1900s, people came here believing the wealth in the earth would be enough to sustain a real future. That optimism built the town. It always does. The confidence, the labor, the stores, the daily routines, all of it grows from the same conviction that this place is going somewhere. But by 1917, Monte had gone quiet. The dream had run its course. Yet, unlike many ghost towns that collapse into scattered debris, Monte held on in an almost eerie way. Its wooden buildings remained, leaning slightly, half embraced by the trees, as if the town had chosen not to vanish completely. There is something deeply cinematic about that image, not ruined beyond recognition, not polished into a museum, just still there, suspended somewhere between disappearance and survival. Part of Monte's mystique comes from its distance and its inaccessibility. It sits on private property, so visitors can only view it from across the creek. That distance adds to the feeling. You cannot fully enter the place. You can only look toward it, as if the town remains just beyond reach. And over the years, that has fed all kinds of stories. Reports of footsteps where no one is visible, sounds in the brush, whispers carried by the trees. Whether you believe in that sort of thing or not, Monte has the kind of atmosphere that encourages imagination. And maybe that is why it stays with people. Some ghost towns feel historical. Monte feels psychological. It reminds us that certain places hold on to emotion long after they lose population. They become containers for memory, projection, and mystery. Monte does not need to perform its haunting quality. It simply exists, and that is enough. 2. Govan, Lincoln County. And now we come to number 2, Govan, one of the darkest and most unsettling towns on this list. If you are looking for a place where history and unease truly intersect, this is it. Govan began in a practical, almost ordinary way. Founded in 1889, it grew because contractors found a large sand deposit useful for railroad construction. That discovery gave the town a purpose. It developed a schoolhouse, a post office, a saloon, and the usual structures that turn a temporary stop into a real community. But Govan's story did not remain ordinary for long. Over the years, the town became associated with a series of shocking, unsolved crimes that cast a long shadow over its history. Early in the 20th century, a prominent local judge and his wife were killed in their home, and the case was never solved. Not long after, another killing took place in the town saloon. Decades later, more tragedy struck in the surrounding area, again without clear answers. And when violence goes unresolved in a small rural place, it does more than frighten people. It changes the emotional temperature of the entire community. Fear settles in. Trust weakens. The town begins to feel less like a shared home and more like a place carrying something broken inside it. As if that were not enough, Govan was later hit by a serious fire, and then by a quieter but equally destructive blow when Highway 2 bypassed the town in 1933. That pattern should sound familiar by now. Once the highway moves on, so often the life of the town moves with it. Govan was left behind, and over time, it nearly emptied out completely. Today, what remains is one of the most striking ruined schoolhouses in Washington. The old brick building still draws photographers, urban explorers, and people curious about the town's darker reputation. Even after the collapse of its steeple in recent years, it remains visually powerful, a shell of civic pride standing in silence over a place that lost far more than population. What makes Govan so compelling is that its decline cannot be explained by economics alone. Yes, the fire hurt it. Yes, the highway bypass mattered. But Govan also reflects the darker side of social isolation. When a town loses its economic purpose, its institutions weaken. When people leave, fewer eyes are watching, fewer hands are helping, and fewer bonds are holding the community together. The result is not just physical decline, it is social unraveling. That may be the deepest lesson of Govan. Rural communities do not just need roads and jobs, they need connection, they need trust, they need neighbors who still see one another. Govan reminds us that when a place becomes isolated economically and emotionally, the damage can reach far beyond empty storefronts and abandoned buildings. And that is what makes this part of our countdown so unforgettable. Nighthawk shows us a ghost town that still feels present. Molson shows us how far people will go to keep a town alive. Bodie shows us the strange power of places that refuse to disappear from the imagination. And Govan shows us the darkness that can take hold when a community begins to come apart. But now we are down to just one final town, and its story may be the most dramatic of all. Because next, we head high into the Cascades, to a place where wealth, ambition, engineering, and human confidence all collided with one overwhelming truth. In the end, the mountain always wins. Part 5. The mountain always wins. And now we have reached number 1, the final stop on this journey, and in many ways, the most unforgettable of them all. If some of the towns on this list were undone by economics, and others by isolation, speculation, or violence, this one was undone by something even larger. This was a town that tried to outbuild, outfinance, and outlast the land itself. And for a while, it looked like it might actually succeed. But in the end, this story delivers the most humbling lesson of all. Because when human ambition goes head-to-head with raw geography, nature does not negotiate. 1. Monte Cristo, Snohomish County. The name alone feels almost prophetic. Monte Cristo. It sounds romantic, dramatic, full of hidden wealth and bold ambition. The town was founded in 1889, deep in the rugged Cascade Mountains, and from the very beginning, it carried the energy of a place that believed it was destined for greatness. Prospectors had discovered gold and silver high in the mountains, at roughly 2,900 feet above sea level. And that discovery set off the kind of excitement that made people think no obstacle was too great, no cost too high, and no location too remote. What followed was extraordinary. Monte Cristo was not just a rough camp with a few tents and muddy trails. It became a real mining town, complete with hotels, banks, processing equipment, and a railroad forced into one of the most difficult landscapes in the state. This was not a small gamble. It was a massive financial and engineering effort. Wealthy investors poured money into the project, including the Rockefeller family, believing that the treasure in those mountains justified everything it would take to reach it. And for a moment, you can understand why people believed. This must have felt like the kind of place where fortunes would be made and a permanent town would rise out of the wilderness. Human beings are very good at convincing themselves that difficulty proves destiny. The harder the challenge, the more certain we become that success will make it all worthwhile. But Monte Cristo had one fatal weakness, and it was a weakness no amount of money could solve. The town sat in a valley where avalanches, floods, and violent weather were not rare disruptions. They were simply part of the natural order. Snowslides came down with destructive force, burying equipment and taking lives. Floods repeatedly tore apart the railroad, which was the town's only real lifeline to the outside world. Each time, people tried to rebuild, and each time, the mountain answered back. That is what makes Monte Cristo feel almost mythic. This was not just a mining town facing bad luck. It was a place locked in a repeated struggle against the landscape itself. The people kept rebuilding the line. The floods kept washing it out. They repaired the access. Nature broke it again. It became a cycle of human determination meeting geological indifference. Eventually, even great wealth and stubborn optimism ran out. The investors pulled back. Confidence faded. By 1920, the last serious residents had effectively surrendered the fight. Monte Cristo was not destroyed in one dramatic instant. It was defeated through repetition, through exhaustion, through the simple reality that the mountain could absorb more punishment than people could. And today, that may be what makes it such a powerful place. Monte Cristo is now one of the most haunting and beautiful hiking destinations in Washington. Reaching it means walking miles into a valley where the remains of hotels, mining structures, and industrial foundations still sit against a backdrop of waterfalls, granite, forest, and silence. It is an astonishing silence, too, because it does not feel empty. It feels full of memory, full of effort, full of all the human noise that once echoed there and has now been folded back into the land. That contrast is unforgettable. The ruins tell you that people really did try. They invested, they built, they hauled equipment into the mountains. They laid track, they staked their futures on what they believed was possible. And for a while, they even found treasure. But the mountain never accepted their claim. Over time, it took everything back. And maybe that is why Monte Cristo deserves the #1 spot. It is more than a ghost town. It is a lesson in humility. So much of modern life encourages us to believe that with enough planning, enough money, enough technology, and enough persistence, we can control almost anything. We can master risk. We can engineer around limits. We can bend the world to fit our goals. But Monte Cristo stands as a quiet contradiction to that belief. For retirees, travelers, and anyone thinking deeply about how to live, that lesson matters. There is wisdom in preparation, of course. There is wisdom in saving, in building, in exploring, in staying curious. But there is also wisdom in recognizing that some forces are bigger than us. Nature, time, change, aging, loss, uncertainty. Not everything can be conquered, and not every battle is meant to be won. Sometimes the strongest decision is not to push harder, but to step back. To respect the terrain, to listen to reality, to yield when yielding is wiser than resisting. And that is the final gift of Monte Cristo. It reminds us that ambition without humility can become self-destruction. But humility, on the other hand, can lead us towards something better, perspective. Because in the end, the real treasure is not always what we extract from the world. Sometimes, it is what the world teaches us when it refuses to be conquered. The rhetoric of ruins. And just like that, our road through Washington's forgotten places comes to an end. We began with quiet river country, moved through abandoned lumber camps, mining towns, rail stops, wheat settlements, and coal communities, and climbed all the way into the high mountain silence of Monte Cristo. Different counties, different industries, different endings. But taken together, they tell one larger story. These towns may be abandoned, but they are not meaningless. They still have something to say. When we visit places like these, we are doing more than looking at old buildings or chasing the thrill of creepy history. We are reading what the landscape remembers. This is what some scholars call the rhetoric of ruins, the way abandoned places speak without saying a word. A collapsed church, a boarded schoolhouse, a rusted rail line disappearing into weeds. Each one tells us that even the strongest-looking communities can change, weaken, or vanish when the economy shifts, when resources run dry, when isolation deepens, or when nature decides to reclaim the ground. And that is exactly why these places matter so much to those of us who love travel, history, and the freedom that comes with this season of life. Ghost towns are not just about the past. They make us think about the present. They force us to ask harder, more liberating questions. What really lasts? What happens when the work is gone, when the road moves elsewhere, when the market changes, when the dream people built a whole town around suddenly disappears? What remains then? The answer, again and again, is this. What remains is character, memory, and the choices people made while they still had time. That is why these towns feel so powerful. They are not dead spaces. They are records of human ambition, faith, struggle, greed, resilience, reinvention, and loss. They are yesterday's futures, places that believed with absolute confidence in a tomorrow that never arrived the way they imagined.
And maybe that is not just their tragedy. Maybe that is also their gift. Because if we are paying attention, they can teach us how to live more wisely right now. To stay flexible, like Chesor. To avoid building everything around one person, like Claquato warned us. To stop waiting for a train that may never come, like Copper City. To remember that identity is bigger than work, like Franklin and Melmont. And above all, to carry a little humility before forces greater than ourselves, just as Monte Cristo teaches so clearly. That, to me, is one of the great joys of traveling in retirement, or in any thoughtful season of life. We do not have to rush through the country, just collecting photos and checking places off a list. We can slow down. We can notice. We can let old places ask us new questions. We can appreciate how fragile and beautiful communities really are, including the ones we live in now. Thank you so much for exploring the hidden topography of Washington with me today. This state holds more than 150 documented ghost towns, and what we covered here is only the beginning. So now, I want to hear from you. Which of these towns stayed with you the most? Was it the eerie stillness of Nighthawk, the dark mystery of Govan, or the breathtaking lesson in humility waiting up at Monte Cristo? If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to like the video, share it with a fellow explorer, and subscribe to Retire and Roam. We have many more roads ahead of us, and plenty more stories still waiting out there in the dust. Until next time, keep roaming, keep wandering, and never forget, the past is still out there. You just have to know where to look.